In the final weeks of April 1945, as the world Adolf Hitler had forged collapsed around him, Joseph Goebbels emerged as the last unwavering believer in a faith that no longer had a future. For more than a decade, he had shaped the vision, language, and emotional pulse of the regime. His speeches had promised triumph, unity, and a destiny carved in iron. Yet now, surrounded by shattered stone and burning streets, he confronted the truth he had spent years refusing to see. The collapse of the Reich was certain. What makes these final days so haunting is not simply the destruction of Berlin or the inevitability of defeat. It is the mindset of the man who stood beside Hitler long after others had lost hope. Goebbels did not merely accept the fall, he embraced it, shaping it into a form of dark redemption. His final writings and broadcasts show a figure who interpreted national ruin not as an error, but as vindication. To him, if Germany could not achieve victory, then Germany must be worthy of sacrifice. Berlin by April had become a city that barely resembled the proud capital of just a few years earlier. Once grand avenues were reduced to cratered trenches, entire districts flickered with flames that never seemed to go out. Civilians slept in basements, clutching blankets, listening to the distant thunder of Soviet artillery. Children scavenged for crumbs in streets where even birds had vanished. And overhead the sky, once filled with parades, banners, and marching formations, was now a swirl of smoke and dust. Inside the Reich Chancellery bunker, reality had warped into a world of delusions. Hitler still issued commands to divisions that no longer existed. Generals argued over maps that no longer mattered. Secretaries typed orders they knew would never be carried out. And among these final loyalists sat Goebbels, calmly recording his thoughts while the world outside disintegrated. His diary entries in these last days reveal a tone unlike anything he had written earlier in the regime. The confident strategist of the 1930s had been replaced by a man who spoke in absolutes, in fate, in destiny. He wrote about Germany's exhaustion, the impossibility of relief, and the disappearance of any realistic chance of survival. Yet he found in all of this a strange kind of meaning. If Germany was destined to fall, he reasoned, then the fall itself must serve a purpose. Goebbels began to reframe the catastrophe as a kind of national trial. The German people, he wrote, must prove their worth by how they faced their end. To him, resistance in the face of hopelessness was not absurd, it was noble. This mindset was not new. Traces of it existed in his earliest diaries long before he ever met Hitler. The young Goebbels had been drawn to romantic suffering, to the idea that greatness could only be achieved through pain. Now, in the bunker, those old philosophies returned with frightening clarity. He no longer saw defeat as a failure. He saw it as purification. The broadcasts he recorded in April carried this same tone. His voice, once used to command cheering crowds, now echoed through nearly empty radio stations. Many transmitters were damaged. Electricity flickered on and off. Listeners who tuned in heard a version of Goebbels far removed from the triumphant orator of earlier years. His tone had changed. It was slower, heavier, as though he was conducting a ceremony rather than giving a speech. He told the German people that cities could crumble, but spirit could not. He insisted that the nation's fate was part of a larger struggle, one that would outlive them all. He framed the approaching destruction not as defeat, but as the final stage of a mission, a test of loyalty, courage, and resolve. He promised no rescue. He offered no fantasy of last-minute salvation. Instead, he urged the population to meet their fate without fear. But outside the bunker, very few still listened. Across Germany, morale had collapsed. Civilians, exhausted by years of bombardment, shortages, and fear, were no longer inspired by speeches. Many dismissed Goebbels' words with bitter laughter or quiet anger. Some turned their radios off halfway through. Others cried, not out of devotion, but because they knew the war was ending with their families hungry, their homes gone, their future destroyed. Yet Goebbels remained convinced that surrender was unforgivable. When he learned that some German towns had raised white flags, he reacted with outrage. When he heard rumors that officials were seeking contact with the Western Allies, he wrote that such actions were acts of personal cowardice. He believed deeply that those who sought compromise were betraying not just Hitler, but history itself. This mindset hardened as Soviet troops pushed toward the center of Berlin. The fighting grew closer each day. The sound of artillery echoed through the government quarter. Buildings shook, windows shattered. The bunker's walls trembled with every distant impact. Yet inside, Goebbels wrote with calm certainty. He described Hitler as unbroken, as a figure whose presence gave meaning to every continued hour of resistance. When Hitler broke down during a staff meeting on April 22nd, upon hearing that armies he believed were coming to rescue him were gone, Goebbels stepped forward as one of the few who still claimed faith. He tried to reassure Hitler that despair was unacceptable. Heroes, he said, did not surrender. Heroes fulfilled their destiny. Goebbels was not simply encouraging Hitler. He was convincing himself that the collapse was part of a divine narrative. The deeper the crisis became, the more Goebbels drifted into mythic comparisons. He wrote about ancient civilizations, comparing Germany to doomed empires of the past. He told himself that great causes were always challenged by overwhelming odds, and he concluded that if the Reich fell, it would not be because its beliefs were flawed, but because its enemies were too numerous. For him, defeat was not humiliation. It was revelation. By April 27th, the situation in Berlin had grown almost impossible. Streets were filled with wounded soldiers. Civilians moved between ruins searching for water or anything edible. Soviet shells landed near the Chancellery Gardens. Fires burned uncontrollably. Yet Goebbels still issued orders to broadcast messages claiming counterattacks were underway. No one believed these reports, but he insisted they continue. The propaganda machine he had spent years building was running on fumes, but he refused to let it stop. His private writings grew more inward, more reflective. He wrote about the collapse as if it were a natural phenomenon, a storm, a flood, a force that could not be resisted. He described the German people as victims of a world that would now be ruled by powers he believed to be morally inferior. And yet he insisted that the ideas of the regime would live on after the physical nation disappeared. He framed everything in terms of sacrifice, as if the destruction of millions was a necessary offering to a higher cause. The single word he repeated most often in these pages was sacrifice. To Goebbels, sacrifice cleansed. Sacrifice gave meaning. Sacrifice justified failure. And as Soviet troops advanced into the heart of Berlin, that belief drove him to decisions that remain among the darkest of the war's final days. On April 30th, when Hitler ended his own life in the bunker, Goebbels recorded the moment with astonishing composure. He did not express shock. He did not lament. He wrote as though he had expected it, as though it were simply the closing of a chapter. He called Hitler's death a symbolic act, one that would echo through centuries. And in that moment, he made the decision to share the same fate. He and his wife Magda gathered their children, dressed them in clean clothes, and told them they were going on a journey to join someone special. The scene, described later by witnesses, remains one of the most chilling details of the war's final hours. Even as the building trembled from explosions outside, Goebbels remained calm, fully convinced that what he was doing was necessary. After the children were gone, Goebbels wrote his political testament, a final attempt to explain the collapse. In this document, he blamed the nation itself for failing to match Hitler's greatness. He wrote that the German people had not deserved the gifts Hitler had given them. He faulted the military leadership, accused civilians of weakness, and declared that the nation must fall with its leader. In his worldview, the destruction of Germany was not a consequence of misjudgment or cruelty. It was punishment and purification. On May 1st, he and Magda walked into the gardens of the Reich Chancellery. Witnesses reported that they sat beside each other, silent, as aides handed them what they needed. Moments later, the last chapter of their story ended. Their bodies were set on fire as Soviet troops moved closer to the grounds. When Allied investigators later found Goebbels' final diaries, they were struck not by fear nor by desperation, but by the clarity of his conviction. He truly believed every word he had spoken. His loyalty to Hitler was not political or strategic, it was spiritual. Even surrounded by the undeniable fact of total ruin, he refused to consider that the ideology he dedicated his life to had been built on falsehoods. He decided instead that the world was wrong. This mindset, the refusal to separate personal identity from a cause, is what makes Goebbels' final days so important to understand. His belief system had swallowed his ability to think critically. He interpreted destruction as proof of righteousness. He saw collapse as confirmation. And he demanded that the German people join him in this final act, even when most of them wanted the war to end. His last radio message, later replayed by Allied analysts, was described as eerily calm. It did not attempt to rally a final defense. It did not offer strategy. It was the voice of a man who believed that downfall was a sacred event. Observers noted that the speech lacked hope, lacked a plan, and lacked any connection to reality. It was an ideological farewell, a declaration that the idea mattered more than the lives of millions. In the aftermath of the war, historians and psychologists studied Goebbels' final writings to understand how a person could justify such devastation. Some argued that he had simply lost touch with reality. Others believed he had been consumed by the myth he had helped create, but most agreed on one point. Goebbels' final acts reveal the ultimate outcome of unchecked fanaticism. When ideology becomes a replacement for truth, destruction can be mistaken for destiny. His final writings showed a man who believed suffering was proof of purity, a man who believed loyalty required total surrender of reason, a man who looked at a burning city and saw a sign of righteousness rather than consequence. And in those last hours, as the bunker grew quiet and Berlin burned above, Goebbels held onto one final conviction, that his idea would outlive the wreckage. That annihilation was not the end, but the beginning of something greater. It was his final illusion and his final tragedy. For the world outside, the fall of Berlin marked the end of the war in Europe. For Goebbels, it marked the fulfillment of a destiny he believed was written long before the first shot was fired. The voice that once filled stadiums with roaring applause ended in a whisper, convinced that ruin was revelation and that destruction was the only true proof of belief.